They called me Fat Tony. To the papers, I was the face of the Genovese family, Harlem's quiet king, the man behind the glass at the Palma Boys Club. To the government, I was another name to cage for 100 years. But to myself, I was just Anthony Salerno, a kid who learned early that in New York, silence pays better than truth. Tonight, I'll tell you how it really happened, how numbers on scraps of paper turned into an empire, how a smile could buy peace, and how a whisper could start a war. No music, no glamour, just rain, memory, and the weight of the years that never left me. Close your eyes and come back with me to East 116th Street, where it all began. They called me Fat Tony, but back then I was just Anthony Salerno, a kid running through East 116th Street with shoes full of holes and pockets full of hope. If you told me that someday my name would echo inside federal courtrooms, I'd have laughed at you. Back then, the only judge I feared was my mother, and she didn't need a gavel, just one look. I came into the world in 1911, when Harlem still smelled of bread and cigar smoke. The Italians, the Jews, the Irish, we all lived on top of each other like bricks in a crooked wall. The air was thick with shouting, singing, and the music of men trying to feed families on nickels. I remember the clang of the trolley, the calls of the fish sellers, and the way the streetlights turned the cobblestones to gold every evening. My father, Umberto, sold cigars out of a narrow shop that was never quiet. He wasn't a gangster. He was a tired man with a back bent from lifting crates, fingers stained brown with tobacco. He believed in hard work in the church. He believed the world rewarded honesty, and maybe once it did. But I watched him scrape by, counting every penny while slicker men in better suits made more in a night than he did in a month. Even as a kid, I noticed who walked with their heads high and who kept them low. The first time I saw a numbers runner, I was 12. He was tall, slick hair, gray fedora tipped low. He moved through the block like he owned it, because in a way he did. Housewives slipped him folded bits of paper. He gave them a smile, sometimes a wink, always the promise of luck. That man had a kind of calm my father never did. That night I asked Ma what he did. "He's a gambler," she said, crossing herself. I didn't see a sinner. I saw success. By 15, I was running errands for the men who ran the policy racket, what outsiders called the numbers. It was gambling, sure, but not the kind you saw in fancy casinos. This was neighborhood money, small bets from working folks who needed a dream. You pick 3 numbers, you hope they hit, and if they do, maybe your rent gets paid. Maybe your kids eat better this week. My job was simple. Collect the slips, deliver the envelopes, keep my mouth shut. That last part was the most important. In Harlem, words could get you rich, or get you buried. I liked the rhythm of it. The mornings full of smoke and coffee, the streets buzzing with whispers. There was something holy about it, the ritual of luck. I learned the faces, the habits, the tells. Old Mrs. D. Marco always played her husband's birthday. The barber used streetcar numbers. Everyone was chasing something, and I was the boy holding their hope. The bosses liked me because I was quiet. "Tony doesn't talk," they'd say. "He listens." And that was true. I listened to everything, the deals, the threats, the laughter that covered fear. I learned that in our world, silence was currency. Talk cheapened a man. Silence made him dangerous. By the time Prohibition came around, the city changed. Booze dried up in the bars but poured down every back alley in New York. I saw crates move under moonlight, trucks rumbling through side streets, cops looking the other way. Harlem was alive, music, liquor, and sin. The jazz clubs glowed like temples. The people danced as if the law was a rumor. I worked for a man named Dutchy Rizzo, a local bookmaker with a face like bad pavement. He wasn't famous, but he was feared. He liked me because I could read numbers as fast as I could breathe. He said, "Tony, you got a head for figures and a stomach for risk. That's a rare mix." He'd send me uptown to deliver packages wrapped in newspaper. I never asked what was inside. Once he caught me looking curious and said, "Kid, curiosity kills more Italians than the flu. Do what you're told." I nodded. He smiled. That was the first time someone in that world called me kid with respect. Those were good years in a crooked way. The city felt like it belonged to us. The cops were paid off, the politicians smiled when they saw us, and Harlem's night hummed like a heartbeat. I'd walk home at dawn, the sky pale over the tenements, pockets heavy with bills still warm from someone else's hand. The smell of bread from the bakery mixed with the scent of gin and cigar smoke, and I thought, this is what power smells like. Then came the lesson that never left me. One of Dutchy's runners, a loudmouth named Benny Costa, decided he was smarter than the rest. He started keeping a little extra for himself, betting with other outfits, talking too much at the bar. Dutchy told me to bring him in. I found Benny behind the pool hall, drunk, laughing, not worried at all. He thought because we'd grown up on the same block I'd look the other way. When I told him Dutchie wanted a word, he sobered fast. "Tony," he said, "we're friends?" I said, "Yeah, we were." The next day Benny was gone. No one asked questions. Not even me. That night, Dutchie poured me a drink. "You did good, kid. You kept your mouth shut." That was the moment I realized silence wasn't just safety, it was promotion. As the 30s rolled in, I wasn't a boy anymore. The paper started using words like syndicate, mob, organization. To us, it was still family. I dressed better, double-breasted suits, silk ties. I started carrying a cigar the way other men carried a badge. It said, "I belong." Harlem was changing too. The music got louder, the money bigger, and every corner had a man with ambition. I met all kinds: gamblers, loan sharks, hustlers, jazz singers with voices that could break a man's heart and take his wallet in the same night. Somewhere between the smoke and the laughter, I found myself running the show. People started calling me Fat Tony, not because I was big, though I was, but because I filled every room I walked into. The nickname stuck. You don't choose your legend, the street writes it for you. I didn't fight it. I made it work. A name like that disarms people. They underestimate you, and that's how you win. Every night at the Palma Boys Social Club, the regulars played cards, sipped espresso, talked about the Yankees. But underneath the laughter were the gears of an empire turning. Harlem's numbers business was the richest in the city, and every cent that passed through my fingers had someone's hope attached to it. I tried to run it fair, if fair exists in crime. We paid the people, we paid the cops, and we kept the peace. You'd be surprised how much respect you get when you make sure everyone eats. Sometimes I'd think of my father, gone by then, and wonder what he'd say if he saw me. Maybe he'd be ashamed. Maybe he'd understand. The world doesn't reward honesty anymore. It rewards control. And I had that, more than most. One evening, rain was tapping the windows of the club. The streets outside were quiet, only the sound of tires hissing through puddles. I sat with a cigar watching the smoke curl. Dutchie was long dead by then. The men around me were younger, hungrier, less patient. One of them asked, "Tony, how'd you get started in all this?" I told him, by listening. He laughed, thinking I was joking. I wasn't. That night, as the rain kept falling, I thought about how far I'd come from that skinny kid in the cigar shop. The city outside looked different, but underneath, it was the same, built on secrets and silence. When I left the club, I walked alone down 116th Street. The puddles reflected the neon lights from a diner across the way. Harlem was sleeping. I heard the echo of a trumpet from somewhere distant, soft and lonely. I thought of all the people whose dreams I'd carried in small folded slips of paper, and how every dream cost something. Mine cost my soul, but I didn't know that yet. I reached into my coat, felt the weight of the envelope I'd been given earlier, thick with cash, warm from my hand. The rain had stopped. The air smelled clean. For a moment, I almost believed in redemption. Then a car rolled past, slow, its headlights slicing the dark. Inside, I saw the outline of two men watching me. They didn't wave. I didn't need them to. In Harlem, every look was a message. I smiled to myself, lit another cigar, and kept walking. That was the night I realized something simple. If the world's gonna make you the villain, you might as well play the part beautifully. By the time the calendar flipped into the early 30s, Harlem and I had both grown up. The jazz was louder, the cops greedier, and I'd learned how to move money the way musicians moved melody, smooth without breaking the rhythm. People on the block started saying my name with a little weight to it. Talk to Tony, he'll square it. It was half respect, half superstition, the way folks said a saint's name before lighting a candle. I never planned to run a racket. It just happened, one collection at a time, until the street began to orbit around me. The bosses downtown liked numbers because they were clean. No blood, no noise. And me? I liked them because they obeyed rules. 2 + 2 was always 4, no matter how crooked the world got. In those days, Harlem's skyline was still low. Tenements leaned into one another like old men sharing secrets. Every window had a story: women sewing shirts, kids chasing rats, men waiting for luck to change. That luck came in the form of tiny slips of paper, and I was the one holding the basket. I carried them in my coat, close to my chest, as if they were sacred texts. Maybe they were. Every number written in pencil carried a prayer. A baby to feed, a landlord to pay, a coffin to buy. The city's dreams weighed about as much as my jacket each night. The trick wasn't collecting, it was trust. People gave you their money because they believed you'd keep your word. Break that and you're done. So I kept books sharper than any accountant on Wall Street. I could tell you who bet the same combination on the 15th of every month, who played a dead husband's birthday, who always reversed their digits because some aunt swore it was lucky. These details built the empire long before the headlines ever mentioned my name. Most nights ended at the Palma Boys social club, though back then it was just a smoky room with peeling wallpaper and a coffee pot that never stopped boiling. We'd sit around the card table counting take, trading gossip, watching the door. Outside, Harlem breathed like a furnace, horns, laughter, police whistles, a siren now and then. Inside, time slowed. Men with names like Louis the Hat and Sal Beans passed envelopes the way priests pass communion. Everyone played their role. Mine was to smile, to nod, to remember everything and repeat nothing. Sometimes when the younger guys got mouthy, I'd tell them, "Gentlemen, words are like bullets. Once they leave your mouth, you can't call them back." They'd laugh, thinking the fat guy was being poetic. I wasn't. I'd seen too many men buried because they mistook noise for power. The depression hit hard, but not for us. When the banks closed, folks still gambled. Hope doesn't follow stock markets. It follows hunger. And Harlem was always hungry. My operation grew because I kept it simple. Pay fair, treat people right, never cheat the block. You do that and they'll hide you from the law themselves. By 35, I had runners of my own, kids like I'd once been, darting through alleys with pocketfuls of dreams. I told them what Dutchie had told me: keep your eyes open, your mouth closed, and your feet moving. They listened mostly. The few who didn't either disappeared or learned quick. Even loyalty needed maintenance. It wasn't all money and numbers. There were moments, quiet ones, when the city felt almost gentle. Like on humid nights when thunder rolled over the rooftops and the rain washed the stink from the streets. I'd sit by the window, smoke curling upward, listening to the drops tick against the glass. For a few minutes, I could almost forget what business I was in. Almost. That peace never lasted. Peace never does in our line of work. One winter morning, a federal man came around asking questions about Dutchie Rizzo. Dutchie was gone, of course, buried somewhere upstate, or maybe not buried at all. The agent wore a cheap hat and an expression that said he thought he was smarter than everyone in the room. He asked where I'd been the night Dutchie vanished. I told him church. He smirked. "Which one?" "The one that forgives everything," I said. He didn't laugh, but the boys did later. The thing about humor, it keeps fear small enough to fit in your pocket. By the end of that decade, the old guard was thinning out. Some caught bullets, others caught indictments. Me, I stayed steady. No flashy cars, no big speeches. I let other men chase headlines while I chased consistency. It worked. When the newspapers screamed about raids and murders, my name never appeared. The silence protected me better than any lawyer. It was around then that I met Vito Genovese for the first time. He wasn't boss yet, not officially, but everyone could feel his pull. He had the kind of quiet that bent rooms. He looked at me once, said, "You keep Harlem calm." That's good. Calm means money. That was it. No promises, no threats. Just acknowledgement. In our world, a nod from a man like that could build a career. And it did. I started dressing sharper, gray suits, wide lapels, felt hats that made my mother proud. But I never forgot the cigar smell of my father's shop. Whenever I lit a stogie, I could see him behind the counter, rolling leaf with rough fingers, trying to make an honest living. Maybe I was still trying to, just in a dishonest city. Harlem kept changing. The jazzmen played faster, the crowds wilder. Gambling joints turned into clubs. Clubs turned into gold mines. And through it all, the numbers kept spinning, endless combinations feeding endless hopes. If I closed my eyes, the sound of coins clinking in glass jars became music. Sometimes I'd imagine the whole neighborhood dancing to it. Then came the first time I realized how deep I was in. A local politician, name not worth repeating, came to me for a loan. He promised to push through a zoning thing that would help the community. I knew what that meant. He wanted a cut. I gave him the envelope anyway because that's how order stays intact. Weeks later, he showed up at the club, sweating through his collar. The press had caught wind of something. He begged me to make it go away. I did. And just like that, I wasn't just running a racket. I was running influence. That's the moment you stop being a hustler and start being a businessman. The suits cost more, but the rules stay the same. Pay who you must, protect what's yours, and keep the books cleaner than your conscience. Around that time, I hired a driver named Carmine Deloro. Quiet kid, good instincts. He used to hum when it rained, a low tune that blended with the sound of the engine. One night, as we rolled through downtown, he asked, "Mr. Salerno, you ever scared?" I told him, only of one thing. "What's that?" "Running out of people who keep their word." He nodded like he understood. But nobody really does until they've watched trust die in front of them. By the late 40s, the money from Harlem flowed like the Hudson. I invested in real estate, trucking, construction. Legit fronts that made the accountant sweat but the IRS smile. People called it laundering. I called it evolution. The street was still in my blood, but the city was growing and I intended to grow with it. Yet no matter how far uptown I moved, I always came back to the block where it started. The same cracked sidewalks, the same stoops full of old men arguing about baseball. They'd wave when they saw my car. To them, I was proof that a kid from nothing could make something. They didn't care how I made it. In Harlem, results matter more than methods. I wish I could say I built my empire clean, but that would be a lie, and if you've come this far listening to me, you deserve the truth. There were beatings, threats, deals that ended with sirens. That's the cost of doing business where the law's just another competitor. But I tried, God help me, I tried, to keep the violence away from the families, away from the kids selling papers on the corner. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. The night that sealed my reputation came in '49. A rival crew tried to muscle in, thinking the fat man was soft. They sent 3 guys to talk. I met them behind a bakery on Pleasant Avenue, the smell of bread thick in the air. They talked loud, hands twitching near pockets. I talked quieter, hands still. When it was over, 2 of them walked away. One didn't. Word spread. Nobody questioned my authority again. After that, people stopped calling me the numbers kid. They just called me Fat Tony. The title stuck like smoke to wool. And I wore it proudly because by then I'd learned something important. In Harlem, respect doesn't come from what you take. It comes from what you're willing to lose. That winter, snow covered the streets, muting the city's noise. I stood outside the club one evening, watching flakes melt on my cigar, thinking about how strange it all was, how a boy counting pennies for his father ended up counting empires for himself. I didn't feel guilt, not exactly. Just a kind of quiet awe at how far silence and numbers had carried me. Inside, the boys were laughing, dealing cards, telling the same stories for the 100th time. I closed the door behind me, the warmth wrapping around my shoulders like an old coat. Someone poured espresso. Someone else lit a fresh stogie. Business as usual. But in my gut, I knew it was only the beginning. The numbers had made me, but they'd also marked me. And every mark, sooner or later, has to be accounted for. That's the thing about arithmetic. It always finds balance. You just might not like the way it adds up. They say every man has 2 angels on his shoulders. One white, one black. In Harlem, both wore gray suits and smoked cigars. By the early 50s, I was living between church bells and sirens. Sunday mornings, I'd sit through Mass at Our Lady of Mount Carmel, nodding to old women who prayed for my soul. By Sunday night, I was at the Palma Boys, counting envelopes thick with the city's sins. The distance between the 2 places was 5 blocks, and a lifetime. The priests liked me because I gave. New pews, fresh paint, candles by the dozen. They didn't ask where the money came from. Maybe they knew, maybe they didn't. Faith is funny that way. It doesn't mind the source as long as the light stays on. During confession, I never knew what to say. Bless me, Father, for I have managed successfully. He'd clear his throat, waiting for crimes. I'd list the small ones, lying, anger, pride, leave out the rest. He'd hand me a few Hail Marys like aspirin and tell me to seek peace. I always meant to, just never had the time. Business was booming. The numbers racket had turned into an industry. We ran Harlem like accountants with better suits. I'd built a network so tight that even the cops placed bets through middlemen. Everybody wanted a piece of luck. That's when I met Frank Costello, the prime minister of the underworld. He was polished where I was blunt, silk to my wool. He'd pour scotch and crystal, light my cigar, and talk about politics like it was chess. He taught me that power wasn't in fists or guns, it was in whispers. The real bosses, he said, don't raise voices. They raise eyebrows. I watched and learned. When Vito Genovese muscled back from Italy, the air grew colder. You could feel tension in every cafe. Costello wanted peace. Vito wanted control. Me, I wanted survival. So I did what I always did. Kept Harlem calm, stayed out of headlines, and listened more than I spoke. People call our life evil, and maybe they're right. But the line between saint and sinner blurs when your neighborhood's starving. I paid hospital bills, buried sons, kept lights on for families the city forgot. Did I profit? Sure. But I gave too. Maybe I was buying redemption in installments. One night, I got a visit from a kid named Johnny Bellini, jittery, maybe 20. He'd robbed one of our runners. They wanted him dead. I looked at him, thin, scared, a version of myself without guidance. Instead of handing him over, I made him work the deli on 116th. Clean job, steady pay. The crew thought I'd gone soft. But years later, when Johnny saved my driver from a stick-up, nobody questioned my judgment again. Mercy's a better investment than fear. It just pays slower. Still, mercy didn't make headlines, violence did. Shootings downtown, kidnappings in Jersey, bosses disappearing. The newspapers called it a mob war. To me it was bookkeeping. Debts being settled, balance restored. I stayed neutral, the fat man everyone underestimated. That's the beauty of being the calm one in a room full of hot tempers. You outlive them. When Costello got shot outside his apartment and survived, he retired quietly. Vito took over. He called me in. "Tony," he said, "you'll represent me in Harlem. You speak for us now." That's how I became something bigger than a bookmaker. A consigliere in daylight, a shield in public. The front boss before anyone used the term. I didn't crave it. But in this world you don't climb, you get lifted. Refuse and they bury you with compliments. Running Harlem under Vito meant diplomacy. Irish crews, Jewish outfits, crooked cops. Each wanted tribute, none wanted war. I handled it with cigars and calm smiles. No shouting, no drama. People say I never raised my voice. Truth is, I didn't have to. A whisper carries farther when everyone's listening for thunder. At home, life was quiet. A modest house in the Bronx, a garden my wife tended. She knew what I did or thought she did. We didn't talk about it. Our peace was built on polite silence, same as my business. Sometimes at night I'd sit on the porch, hear distant jazz, and wonder if God kept separate ledgers for men like me. Did good deeds cancel bad ones, or was it all the same ink? I didn't know. But I hoped when the final audit came he'd grade on a curve. Then one summer afternoon word reached me. Vito was going away, narcotics charges. The family needed a caretaker. They picked Tommy Eboli at first, then looked my way. "Tony keeps things steady," someone said. Steady, that was my curse and my crown. Before I could refuse, the crown was on my head. That's how it happens. One day you're the numbers kid, the next, the face of the Genovese family. No ceremony, no applause. Just a heavier cigar and fewer people willing to meet your eyes. I remember walking into the club that night. The boys went quiet, waiting to see how I'd act. I poured myself espresso, sat down, and said, "Nothing changes. We work smart, we stay quiet, we live long." They nodded. Maybe they believed me. I almost believed myself. But something did change. From that day on, every step echoed louder. Every shadow looked like a camera flash. The church still welcomed my donations, the streets still whispered my name, but now the feds whispered it too. I kept my routines. Sunday mass, Monday meetings, Friday dinners with the same bottle of Chianti. Repetition kept the fear manageable. Still, some nights, lying awake, I'd hear both angels arguing on my shoulders. One said, "You built something lasting." The other asked, "At what cost?" Neither ever won. The rain was falling again the night I realized there's no clean exit from this life. You can retire your body, not your name. Your name keeps working long after you're tired. I finished my cigar, flicked the ash into the street, and watched it glow in the gutter. Somewhere a church bell rang. Somewhere else a siren answered. Between saints and sinners, that's where I'd always belong. They say money talks. Maybe it does, but real power whispers. By the mid-50s I had learned that respect, not fear, keeps men loyal longer than bullets ever could. The press liked to paint us as animals in suits. Truth is, I ran Harlem like a businessman with better insurance. We had schedules, payrolls, meetings that started on time. Every dollar that came through the numbers rackets was recorded by hand in neat, looping script. Order meant survival. Chaos drew cops. Each morning I'd walk into the Palma Boys social club like a shopkeeper opening his store. Same chair, same cup of espresso, same quiet nods from the crew. It wasn't glamour, it was routine. The kind of rhythm that keeps a man from thinking too hard about what he's actually doing. My rule was simple. Everyone eats, everyone behaves. If a cop wanted an envelope, he got it. If a shopkeeper complained about a shakedown, we fixed it. Fairness kept the peace better than threats. Harlem trusted me because I didn't take more than I needed. That's rare in our world. Now and then some young blood would strut in, loud from the movies, itching to prove he was tough. I'd let him talk. When he ran out of breath, I'd say, "Kid, tough is easy. Try being steady." Half of them listened. The rest learned the hard way that silence outranks swagger. People think gangsters live wild, constant danger, high drama. Most of the time it's paperwork and paranoia. You spend your days counting money, your nights counting who might betray you. I learned to sleep light, half awake even when dreaming. Rain on the window was the only sound that ever truly relaxed me. It reminded me that the world was bigger than our schemes. My relationship with the law was transactional. We supplied campaign donations. They supplied indifference. Once, an ambitious district attorney called me in for a conversation. He wanted headlines, I wanted quiet. I offered him a cigar and said, "You arrest me, you make the papers. You ignore me, you make a career." He thought about it, took the cigar and changed the subject to baseball. That's business. That's respect. Inside the family, politics was bloodier. Every boss wanted loyalty, but few earned it. I kept mine by never pretending to be what I wasn't. I wasn't a killer, though I ordered killings. I wasn't a saint, though I paid for altars. I was a manager of men and egos, a broker of peace in a city addicted to conflict. The younger guys started calling me the mayor of Harlem. It wasn't official, but it felt right. I solved problems, marital, financial, mortal. People came to me because I listened, not because I shouted. You can build an empire on listening. One night, a driver from another outfit clipped one of our trucks and refused to pay damages. My boys wanted to torch his garage. Instead, I invited him to dinner. Over veal and red wine, I asked about his family, his bills, his dreams. By dessert, he agreed to pay double. When he left, one of my captains said, "Tony, why waste time talking to a bum?" I told him, "Because tomorrow that bum will tell everyone Fat Tony treated him like a man." Fear fades. Respect grows interest. That became my motto. I even had it framed in the back office. Business is respect. No one believed I meant it, until they saw how long I lasted. In '57, when the famous meeting upstate, Appalachian, blew the lid off the whole organization, the feds dragged in every name they could spell. They never touched me. I'd been careful. Too careful, maybe. They called me invisible. That suited me fine. A shadow doesn't get subpoenaed. Still, the spotlight burned others, and with every arrest, my role grew. The family needed someone who could smile for cameras, someone respectable enough to distract the heat. That's how the front boss idea started, though back then we didn't have a word for it. They wanted a face, not a flame. I became that face. Reporters described me as jovial, courteous, almost gentle. They weren't wrong. Charm is cheaper than lawyers. I'd shake their hands, pose for photos, joke about my diet. Behind me, the real business flowed untouched. Every headline about Fat Tony Salerno was a decoy. The louder the noise, the safer the silence behind it. Sometimes, alone at night, I wondered if I'd sold part of my soul for that safety. But what good is a soul if you never get to use it? We all trade something. Mine bought peace for the men under me and food for half of Harlem. That counted for something in my book. My wife liked to say I was happiest in two places, at Mass and at the club. Maybe because both smelled of smoke and forgiveness. I'd light a candle for the dead, then light a cigar for the living, trying to balance the books between them. When the '60s rolled in, the city changed again. Drugs flooded the streets, something I'd sworn to keep out. Heroin destroyed neighborhoods faster than any cop could. I banned it from my operations, but others didn't. Young bosses chased quick money, I chased sleep. They called me old-fashioned. I called them doomed. You could see it coming, the fall, the trials, the cameras. But back then, under the hum of rain and neon, we still believed our code would hold. No informants, no wiretaps, no cracks in the walls. We were wrong, of course. Time finds every weakness. Still, if you'd asked me then what success meant, I'd have told you this. A man walks down his street, and every door he passes stays open. That's business. That's respect. Silence built the family. Not the kind that hides fear, the kind that keeps order. When men stop talking, they start listening, and in our world, listening is survival. By the 1960s, the name Genovese carried weight like an anchor. Vito was gone, serving time, but his shadow still ran every table. We operated through glances, gestures, unfinished sentences. The fewer words, the stronger the bond. That's how we stayed alive when everyone else was getting caught bragging. I became the front boss, though no one used the title yet. It meant I smiled for the press, shook hands at weddings, and took the heat while others moved in the dark. It wasn't glory, it was camouflage. A decoy in a good suit. But I played my part. If the government wanted a villain, I gave them one with manners. The Palma Boys social club turned into headquarters. From outside, it looked like an old men's cafe. Espresso, checkers, harmless talk. Inside, fortunes shifted over whispers. Every week, envelopes arrived, quiet as church offerings. No drama, no blood. That was my system. Calm, clean, disciplined. Even the cops preferred me in charge. I kept Harlem peaceful, and peace makes paperwork easier. Some nights I'd sit by the window watching rain streak down the glass, the city glowing behind it. That sound, the steady tap of drops, was our music. It reminded me that noise is what gets you caught. Rhythm is what keeps you free. We didn't use phones much. Messages traveled by hand, sealed in envelopes that smelled of tobacco and trust. If someone asked too many questions, we answered with silence. No threats, no arguments. Just quiet, which always says more. The men under me were loyal because I never lied to them. I told them the truth. This life ends two ways, prison or cemetery. Between the two, we try to eat well and sleep light. They respected that honesty. They called me the old man even when I wasn't old yet. Age isn't counted in years here. It's counted in funerals you've attended without flinching. My reputation spread beyond Harlem. Other families came to me when tempers ran hot. I'd pour coffee, listen to both sides, and end wars before they started. Some called it diplomacy. I called it exhaustion. Violence is bad for business. Of course, peace doesn't last forever. You can't run a kingdom built on secrets without cracks appearing. But back then, for a little while, we had something close to harmony. Men made their money, kids went to school, the streets stayed quiet. Even the priests smiled when I walked into church. People think crime families are like the movies, betrayal, blood, drama. The truth is duller and sadder. Most days it's just men growing old in small rooms, holding on to fading power. But we had pride and we had silence, and sometimes that feels like enough. I remember one afternoon, a young reporter knocked on the club door, nervous, asking if I was really the boss. I told him, "Kid, if I was, I wouldn't be telling you." He laughed. I didn't. He left with a story about cigars and coffee cups, nothing more. That's how silence wins, by giving people just enough noise to fill their notebooks. Late at night, when the city finally slept, I'd stand outside the club and look up at the Harlem sky, dim, smoky, endless. The boys thought I was counting money in my head. But I was counting years, wondering how long silence could hold back time. Every empire has an expiration date. We just don't print ours. Every kingdom has a palace. Ours was a narrow storefront on 116th Street with cracked tile, 3 tables, and a coffee pot older than most of the crew. No sign outside. Just the smell of espresso and cigar smoke curling into the hallway. To strangers it looked like a retiree hangout. To us it was headquarters, heart, lungs, and memory of the family. Every morning I'd unlock the door, flick on the neon clock, and listen to the hum of the city waking up. Men drifted in one by one, drivers, bookkeepers, collectors. They never came all at once. Rhythm was safety. First the smell of coffee, then laughter, then business whispered between sips. The Palma Boys was less about crime than control, keeping tempers cool, schedules regular, cash flowing like a heartbeat. We sat beneath fading photographs of old Harlem, streetcars, Sunday parades, faces that once owned the night. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring at them, wondering which frame I'd end up in when time finally filed my paperwork. The boys thought I was daydreaming. I was rehearsing disappearance. My seat was near the window, same chair every day. From there I could watch the avenue without ever turning my head. Kids ran by with baseball gloves. Cops strolled pretending not to notice us. Across the street, the bakery delivered bread. Routine kept suspicion asleep. That's how you survive, by looking ordinary so long the world forgets to look deeper. The conversations were half business, half philosophy. How to handle a debt. How to raise a son. What the Yankees should have done in the ninth. It wasn't glamour, it was family life. Louder, smokier, less forgiving. Each man owed something to the table. Money, loyalty, silence. Mostly silence. Every week we hosted the neighborhood's small grievances. 2 drivers arguing over routes. A tailor late with payments. A cousin caught stealing from his cousin. I'd listen, nod, settle it. No shouting, no fists. Just order, restored like an old painting carefully cleaned. People left calmer than they arrived, and that was good for everyone. Peace saves more lives than bullets ever did. By evening the club filled with smoke so thick it blurred faces. Someone would play Sinatra on the jukebox. Someone else would hum along. We'd talk about nothing, which in our business was everything. Talking about nothing meant everything was fine. Sometimes outsiders dropped by, priests collecting donations, politicians shaking hands, reporters sniffing stories. They'd see old men playing cards and leave disappointed. They never saw the ledgers in the back room or the maps with tiny marks showing every corner that paid tribute. Camouflaged by boredom, that was our art. One rainy night, a young cop fresh to the precinct walked in, trying to prove himself. He demanded names, licenses, permits. I poured him coffee. By the second cup he was telling me about his newborn daughter. When he left, he thanked me for my cooperation. The crew laughed for a week. That's the difference between a threat and hospitality. Both end the same way, but one leaves a better aftertaste. Years slid by inside that haze of smoke and routine. We buried friends quietly, toasted their memories with wine older than some of our regrets. New faces came eager, respectful. I taught them what Dutchie once taught me: keep the noise down, the money straight, and the door unlocked for luck. They called it superstition. I called it insurance. The Palma Boys became more than a clubhouse. It was confession without forgiveness, church without sermons. We went there to remember who we were before the city changed too much. Outside, Harlem was turning shiny. New buildings, new faces, new drugs I wanted no part of. Inside, time held still. Same clock, same jokes, same silence between them. Late nights I'd stay after the others left, sweeping cigar ash from the floor, locking the till, listening to the faint drip of rain outside. I'd think about the first slip of paper I ever carried as a kid, the beginning of all this, and how it led here to a small room full of ghosts pretending to drink coffee. If heaven keeps ledgers, I hope they balance mine against the calm I gave this city. Harlem slept better when the lights inside the Palma Boys stayed on. And maybe that's all the legacy a man like me deserves. A quiet street, a clean cup, and a name spoken softly long after the door has closed. To start small the way all storms do. A car parked too long across the street. A new face at the newsstand pretending to read. Phones clicking when they shouldn't. At first you tell yourself it's nothing. Then you realize, nothing's exactly what they want you to think. By the late 60s I could feel the government breathing down our necks. New laws, new agents, new ambition. The papers called it organized crime. We just called it Tuesday. But this time they weren't chasing ghosts, they were chasing me. The first real sign came one morning when I opened the club and found the back door latch scraped clean. Tiny marks, metal on metal like someone testing it in the dark. I didn't tell the crew. No point in spreading panic. Instead, I had the locks changed and the espresso stronger. Soon after, I noticed a black sedan following my Cadillac from the Bronx to Harlem. Same route, same distance. I'd pull over, buy a paper, and watch them pretend to read maps. Feds are easy to spot. They dress like men who don't want to be noticed and end up noticed twice as much. I told the boys, from now on, assume every wall's got ears. We cut phone talk to zero. Conversations happened walking, never sitting. If someone asked a question twice, he didn't belong. That's how paranoia becomes policy. One afternoon a pair of agents came right into the Palma Boys, badges out, grins rehearsed. They wanted to ask a few friendly questions. I poured them coffee. They asked if I knew about illegal gambling in the neighborhood. I told them, only thing illegal here is the price of sugar. They didn't laugh. They looked around the room, eyes counting ashtrays, memorizing faces. When they left, one said, "We'll be seeing you, Mr. Salerno." I said, "Then next time bring cannoli." Even humor's a weapon if you use it slow enough. After that, we found microphones in a light fixture. Tiny things wired into the ceiling. The feds were getting smarter, smaller, patient. We started meeting in cars, in alleys, in church basements if we had to. The air itself felt watched. Rain on the windows became the only sound we could trust. They thought they were hunting a gangster. But I was a businessman, and businessmen adapt. I shifted everything through middlemen, cash only, no paper trails. To the government, I became smoke. To the street, I stayed solid. Two versions of the same man, neither completely true. Still, pressure changes people. Some of the younger guys started cracking, boasting in bars, talking too loud. I warned them. You want to live long? Learn to disappear in your own chair. They nodded, but youth always believes it's invisible. One by one, the headlines started spelling their names. I lasted because I treated the feds like weather, something to endure, not fight. You close the shutters, keep dry, wait it out. Storms pass, records fade, but silence endures. One night, long after closing, I sat alone at the club. Outside, thunder rolled over Harlem like an empty stomach. A flash of lightning lit the window, and for a second I saw my reflection. Older, heavier, but still calm. Then I saw something else in that reflection. A shadow moving behind the glass. When I turned, nothing. Just rain. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was them. Either way, I poured another espresso, lit a cigar, and whispered to no one in particular, "If you're listening, boys, make sure you spell my name right." You don't hear the gavel first. You hear the cameras. Flashes, questions, voices shouting your name like it belongs to someone else. Then comes the gavel, small, sharp, final. That sound still echoes in my head. It was 1985 when they came for me. They called it the commission case, the government's grand dream of breaking every family at once. 7 bosses, 1 courtroom, 100 microphones, and 1,000 lies dressed as evidence. They said we ran New York. I said I ran a social club that served good espresso. They didn't laugh. The morning they arrested me, I was trimming roses outside my house in the Bronx. Plainclothes agents pulled up in cars like a funeral procession. One read from a paper, the rest watched like men who already knew the ending. I nodded, wiped the dirt from my hands, and asked if I could change into a better suit. They let me. Respect, even in cuffs, still counts for something. The courtroom smelled of sweat, paper, and ambition. The prosecutors spoke like preachers. They showed tapes, grainy, muffled conversations, half words, half guesses. They called it proof. I called it static. But juries believe what they're told to hear. Every day they painted me larger than life, head of the Genovese family, underworld chancellor, the most powerful man in America. I'd sit there, old and tired, thinking if I was that powerful, would I be sitting here? But you can't argue with myth once it's written. The papers need villains. I was convenient. My lawyer said I should look sympathetic. I told him, I'm a 75-year-old man in a cardigan. Sympathy's built in. He didn't smile. Neither did the judge. When the verdict came, it was read slow, like poetry carved in stone. Guilty. Conspiracy. Racketeering. 100 years without parole. 100. The number hit harder than any bullet I'd ever dodged. I did the math. At 75, they weren't sentencing me to prison. They were sentencing me to memory. As they led me out, I heard reporters shouting, asking if I had regrets. I stopped, turned, and said, regrets for men who didn't get what they wanted. They printed it on the front page. It sounded colder than I meant it. Prison wasn't violent, not for me. The guards respected age, and most of the young cons treated me like folklore. They'd whisper, that's Fat Tony. I'd nod, sip weak coffee, pretend I didn't hear. In the yard, I walked slow circles, breathing air that smelled nothing like Harlem. You don't miss freedom at first. You miss routine. The sound of the espresso machine, the argument over baseball, the door opening at noon. Nights were the hardest. Rain tapping metal roofs instead of windows. No cigars allowed, no city lights. Just darkness that hummed. I'd lie awake and think of all the men who'd called me boss, all the envelopes that once crossed my desk, all the silence that had bought me peace, and now bought me nothing. But I never cursed the life. I chose it same as it chose me. And even behind bars, I stayed true to one rule. Never complain, never explain. Silence built my world. Silence would bury it. When the lights went out each night, I could almost hear Harlem breathing beyond those walls. The soft hiss of tires on wet pavement, jazz leaking from a half-open door, rain tapping the old windows of the Palma Boys. That sound carried me to sleep. Still does. 100 years. That's what the judge said, his voice flat as marble. Not 99. Not life. 100 like he wanted the number to echo. It did. When you're 75, 100 years isn't punishment, it's punctuation. A period at the end of a long, loud sentence. They called it justice, I called it math. The bus ride to prison was quiet. No chains, just the hum of tires and a guard who kept glancing at me like he expected a confession. I gave him none. What was there to confess? That I built a business people wanted? That I believed silence was safer than truth? He wouldn't have understood. Inside, time slowed to syrup. Mornings came with the clank of doors and the smell of powdered eggs. Evenings brought the same walls painted different by the sunset. Men half my age walked circles in the yard, chasing muscles or redemption. I chased memories. They gave me a small cell. One window, one shelf, one metal bed that sang when you turned. I decorated it with letters I never answered and a single photograph of Harlem, taken before it changed. Sometimes I'd stare at that picture until I could hear the city again. The rain on the awning, the faint buzz of neon, the low trumpet from a club that no longer existed. Memory's a better escape than any tunnel. The guards called me Mr. Salerno. Respect, maybe curiosity. They knew I wasn't dangerous anymore. The danger was in the legend, not the body. But legends live longer than the men who make them. I settled into routine, coffee at dawn, reading the paper when I could get it, walking the yard in slow loops. I spoke little. Even here, silence had weight. A man who talks too much in prison ends up with fewer teeth. Old habits keep you alive. Once, a young inmate asked what I missed most. I told him, rain? He laughed, said it rains plenty here. I shook my head. Not Harlem rain, I said. The kind that sounds like forgiveness. At night I'd lie awake listening for that sound, but all I got was the hum of fluorescent lights and distant footsteps. Still I'd close my eyes and pretend, the window fogging, cigar smoke hanging, the club door creaking open. For a few minutes I'd be home again. They thought 100 years would erase me. But memory doesn't keep time, it just loops like an old record. And every loop plays the same refrain. I was Fat Tony. I kept my mouth shut. I outlasted the noise. Inside days dissolve. They don't pass, they fade. One bleeds into the next until even the guards stop checking the calendar. That's prison, not the walls, but the forgetting. I learned to live small. Folded my clothes with military precision, lined my shoes, kept my books stacked by height. Order gave shape to emptiness. Every morning, I brewed instant coffee and sat by the window, watching light crawl up the concrete. If you squinted, the dust looked like smoke in the old club. They called it correction. I called it rehearsal for death. But I didn't fear it. I'd made peace with endings long ago. The only thing that stung was knowing the streets moved on without me. New faces, new codes, no silence, just noise. Everyone talked now. The code of Omerta, the one that raised me, was gone, traded for microphones and plea deals. Some of the young inmates came to me for advice. They wanted stories. I gave them lessons. Power's not loud, I told them. Respect doesn't shout. They nodded like students, but I could see in their eyes they wanted shortcuts, not wisdom. Nobody has patience anymore. I read the papers when I could. Names I knew turned into obituaries or government witnesses. The families fractured, bosses gone, loyalty auctioned for lighter sentences. The whole thing we built, our silent empire, crumbling in headlines. Maybe it was time. Maybe it was justice. All I knew was that silence had become a language no one spoke. Still, even here I kept my manners. I said please, thank you, good morning. Courtesy confuses people who expect menace. It keeps you human when the world wants to forget you are. At night I'd lie on my bunk, listening to rain tapping the metal roof. It sounded different from Harlem's rain, sharper, colder, but it carried the same rhythm. Each drop a memory, each pause a prayer. And I'd whisper to the dark, I'm still here. Not as a boss, not as a legend. Just as Anthony, the man who kept quiet longer than most. Rain has a way of talking when no one else will. In prison it was the only voice that sounded like home. Every drop on the window whispered names I tried to forget. Vito, Frank, Dutchie, Louis, the men who'd built and buried our world. Sometimes I'd close my eyes and hear them laughing again, cards shuffling, cups clinking, Harlem breathing outside the club doors. Ghosts with cigar smoke for faces. They never blamed me for surviving. They just kept talking, soft as the rain, reminding me who I was before the headlines. One night a guard asked if I believed in heaven. I told him, sure. I just hoped they let in men who did bad things for good reasons. He looked at me like I was joking. I wasn't. Letters stopped coming. People move on. A few old friends died quietly, others not so quietly. The family scattered like ashes in wind. Still, I'd sit by the window every storm listening. And sometimes if I stayed very still, I'd hear Harlem itself. The city murmuring beyond the rain, forgiving or forgetting, I couldn't tell which. I used to think silence was my armor. Now I know it was my confession. All the words I never spoke ended up here, in the rhythm of falling water, carrying pieces of me back to the streets I loved. When the rain stopped, the world felt hollow. So I prayed for storms. It ends the way it began, with silence. No headlines, no crowds, just the slow ticking of a clock that isn't sure it's still needed. The guards walk past my cell without looking in. Outside, the rain starts again, soft, patient, like an old friend who never stopped visiting. I lie back, eyes half closed, and think of Harlem. The glow of streetlights on wet pavement, the smell of espresso and smoke, laughter drifting from the Palma Boys Club. For a moment I can almost hear it, the hum of life, steady and distant, waiting just beyond the bars. People used to ask what power felt like. It felt like this, knowing when not to speak. Words built empires and ruined them. Silence kept mine alive long enough to be remembered. They called me Fat Tony. But in the end, I was just Anthony Salerno, from 116th Street, Harlem, New York. A man who counted other people's dreams until time came to collect his own. The rain keeps falling. And for the first time in years, I don't count the drops. I just let them fall. Quiet. Endless.